The story starts on a snowy night at a remote cabin. Inside, a glass of wine had been spilled on the floor. It turned out the wine was poisoned, and our main character, Ian, a long-haired blonde man, had unknowingly consumed it. In front of Ian stood a dignified man who admitted to adding an extra strong dose of poison because Ian possessed extraordinary power that filled others with anxiety. This power had caused suffering in the Empire, affecting countless lives. Ian was bewildered and wanted to know why this man had betrayed him. The man explained that he was terrified of Ian's overwhelming strength, to the point of madness. He apologized, calling Ian an old friend, and expressed deep remorse. He then left the cabin, disappearing into the night, leaving Ian alone on his knees, slowly succumbing to the poison. As the cabin started to catch fire, Ian revealed a hidden plan. He produced a dagger with time-manipulating magic embedded in it. With a surge of regret for his past actions, he stabbed himself just before the poison reached his heart. The floor around him glowed blue, forming a circle and a triangle, while strange voices chanted in an unknown language. This was Ian's chance to rewrite his life. He experienced a rapid flashback of his past, including his mother's death, his encounter with the Emperor, and a battlefield filled with crows picking at the fallen. Suddenly, he found himself in his childhood body, unharmed. His mother, who had previously passed away, was alive again. Looking around, he saw a white tent with a white flag. Outside, children lined up for skill assessments conducted by the spiritual knights, who determined if they could harness magic. Ian realized he traveled back in time. In this empire, magicians were the backbone, and at age 12, all children had to undergo the Mano reaction assessment. It consisted of 2 parts: the mana brain for magic manifestation and the mana heart for magic control and generation. Those possessing both talents were accepted into the prestigious Magic Academy and treated as nobility. Ian had traveled back in time, further than he had expected. He had spent a lot of time researching the dagger he used, and luckily, he had it with him when he died. The reason he was so interested in going back in time was to wash away the guilt from the blood on his hands. In his previous life, he had killed many people while serving his closest friend, Emperor Ragnar. But as it turned out, the Emperor had merely used him and then discarded him like trash. This time, Ian was determined not to let his life end meaninglessly. He left his mother and made his way to the spiritual knight's camp. Approaching one of the guards, he introduced himself as Ian Page. The guard recognized him as Vanessa's son and allowed him to enter the tent, but warned him not to ask too many questions of the magician inside. Inside the tent, Ian met the magician, a man with long black hair and a ponytail. The magician instructed Ian to lower his head as he was going to use mana to stimulate his brain. Ian complied and felt a momentary dizziness. The magician smiled and told Ian that his life was about to change for the better. Ian didn't seem particularly thrilled by this news, probably because he had expected it. He knew that merely getting into the academy wasn't enough. He demonstrated his skills by conjuring a fireball in one hand and manipulating water in the other, casting 2 spells simultaneously. The magician was astonished and questioned Ian if someone had taught him these skills. Ian firmly denied any formal instruction, and the magician, using his interrogation magic, confirmed that Ian was telling the truth. Their conversation was interrupted by Ian's mother's screams. Ian rushed to see what was happening and found the guard bothering Vanessa, claiming she had been widowed for 7 years and shouldn't be playing hard to get at her age. This enraged Ian, but the magician intervened, asserting that Ian and his family, now possessing mana power, were on equal footing with nobles. Insulting nobles was a serious crime, punishable by execution. The nasty guard fell to the floor, pleading for mercy and begging to be spared. He turned to Vanessa and did the same, apologizing for his earlier hurtful words and asking for forgiveness. Ian walked over to the guard, telling him to listen closely. He knew all about the terrible things the guard had said and done in front of his mother. Ian threatened the guard, warning him to pass on the message to his fellow troublemakers. If any of them behaved that way again, they would face severe consequences. The guard nervously agreed, sweat dripping down his face. He was surprisingly frightened of a 12-year-old boy. After this exchange, Ian thanked the magician for his help. The magician humbly replied that it was his duty to protect fellow magicians. He introduced Sir Aaron, the man who would guard Ian and Vanessa temporarily while arrangements were made. Lord Aaron had a mustache and wore a white cape. Ian agreed to go with Aaron, holding his mother's hand as they embarked on the next stage of their new life. The magician watched them leave and couldn't help but be impressed by Ian's intelligence and capability at such a young age. As evening fell, the town grew quiet. The disgruntled guard, now drunk and furious, walked down the street, seething that a child and a lowly kitchen maid had humiliated him. He vowed to get revenge, especially on Vanessa. However, a hooded figure, Ian, lurked behind him. Ian used paralysis magic on the guard, freezing him in place on a bridge. Ian had overheard the guard's disrespectful comments about his mother and was far from pleased. He removed his hood and started concocting a story to explain the guard's demise. He claimed the guard had drowned accidentally while intoxicated, seeking solace from his humiliation. While the guard was paralyzed, Ian pushed him into the water and watched as he met his end. Ian pondered for a moment whether it was right to let himself perish in this manner. After all, the primary reason for his time-traveling journey was to become a better person this time around. As he gazed into the distance, he came to the realization that he could never completely wash away the guilt staining his hands. His best course of action was to safeguard the people most dear to him, particularly his mother. Watching the lifeless body of the guard drift by served as a haunting reminder of how he had been abandoned to die in the cabin during his previous life. Ian swiftly returned home, feeling utterly drained as his use of the paralyzing spell had depleted his mana. He reminded himself that he needed to grow his young body as quickly as possible. In his past life, he had earned recognition as a first-class magician after just 1 year at the Magic Academy. However, despite his newfound magical abilities, his mother had not been able to enjoy a life of luxury and had passed away. Ian looked down at his sleeping mother, determined to protect her this time so that she could live longer. In an opulent building, the capital of the Green River Empire, Emperor Terry, a blond man with a fancy mustache and attire, engaged in a conversation with another magician named Herbert. They discussed our protagonist, Ian. Herbert explained that mana was the energy flowing in one's blood, and once someone possessed a mana brain and a mana heart, they were recognized as a magician. However, proper training was necessary to effectively wield this mana for casting spells. To their amazement, our protagonist had displayed the ability to use magic without any training. Herbert likened Ian to the first magician, a historical figure who had taught himself to use mana and had become known as the first magician. Terry was skeptical, finding it hard to believe that someone today could use magic without attending an academy. Herbert agreed that it was suspicious and intended to verify it with his own eyes. Emperor Terry contemplated the implications of this revelation, realizing that if it were true, Ian possessed a potentially dangerous ability. He summoned his son, Prince Hayden, who had been eavesdropping outside. Hayden, having spent 5 years away from the castle, was ordered by his father to go outside and reconnect with the world. Terry granted him 300 soldiers and 3 magicians, tasking him with the mission to find and bring back a boy named Ian. For a moment, he hesitated, thinking it was foolish to trust his son with something so important. However, Hayden insisted, saying he could be trusted and would complete the mission. The Emperor reluctantly agreed, telling him to start preparing immediately. The journey to Moglian had been a long one. Herbert, who had still been in the room, joked, saying that he should go and prepare as well, since it would be hard for him to find 3 magicians willing to go outside. As soon as he left the room, his face turned serious. His assistant asked if he was going back to the tower to find the magicians, but Herbert shook his head. He began walking ahead with determination, saying that there was somewhere he needed to go first. Back to where Ian was staying, he looked out the window, as if expecting someone. The imperial family should have been coming for him soon, and things were going as planned. Ian knew that the magician must have been impressed by his skills and had reported it to his superiors. Once the current emperor found out, he would have sent the prince with a bunch of soldiers. Herbert would likely come too. He was the master of the ivory tower, and sooner or later, there would be an internal war between the imperial castle and the ivory tower. Ian knew this from his past life. He didn't know which side he would help, but he was determined not to be exploited by anyone this time. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the imperial order, which had come much sooner than expected. Outside, he was greeted by the magician from earlier, holding a magic orb. He said that the emperor had issued an imperial order. Ian followed the customs, getting down on one knee and putting his fist over his chest. A message from the emperor appeared from the magic orb, and the magician began to read it aloud. It stated that the emperor had heard of Ian's high abilities and that his name would be recorded in the ivory tower's registry. The emperor also invited Ian to visit him at the imperial castle, sending his eldest son to accompany him. Once the message had been read, Ian rose to his feet and was immediately greeted by a knight named Arnold. He informed our protagonist that he and his fellow knight had been assigned the honor of serving him and would escort him to the Lord's castle. While they waited for the prince to arrive, the lord of the Moglian territory, Marcus, awaited their arrival. He had a full beard and a fur coat. He looked over to his children, advising them to be mindful of their speech. Although he was young, he was still a magician, and the emperor was interested in him. Marcus extended his arms wide, welcoming Ian to their castle. Ian spent the next few weeks at the castle, becoming a hot topic of conversation. Even the maids began to talk about him, impressed that someone so young could create fireballs with his bare hands. Ian could be seen at the training grounds, where he spent the majority of his time. He practiced his magic by raising his hand and summoning a frost nova. He had even acquired a new outfit. Although his frost nova worked, surrounding him with ice and snow, Ian wasn't satisfied. He believed it wasn't good enough. In his previous body, he could have frozen the whole castle, not just the training grounds. His powers were limited, and he needed something to compensate for his lack of mana. Someone interrupted his training, rushing over and gasping for breath, clearly distressed. The man had a monocle and gray hair. He asked for Ian's help, explaining that Lord Marcus had gone missing. Lord Marcus had gone hunting goblins yesterday but hadn't returned. Even worse, his son and all the knights who went with him were missing too. Ian tried to think back to his previous life for clues about where they might be, but he wasn't sure. He knew it wasn't their time to die yet. Lord Marcus had met his end later, assassinated by an enemy empire just before a big war. His son had fled the Magrian territory to escape the war and was eventually beheaded for his crimes. In this world, each territory had its own station magician. Ian suggested that the man seek help from their magician, but the old man informed him that the magician had been assigned other missions and was not currently in the territory. They were on their own. Ian was shocked because it was unusual for a magician to leave their assigned territory. He wondered if it was related to him, fearing that the magician might have been giving information about him to Herbert, the Tower Master. This could be dangerous because Ian's most powerful weapon was his ability to know the future. If the timeline was disrupted, he would lose this advantage. Despite the risks, Ian told the old man that he would help them find Lord Marcus. Ian quickly prepared to leave, putting on his cloak, but his mother called out his name. She had heard what was happening and was worried because Ian was still a child. Ian reassured his mother, saying that he was now a magician and would return safely. Lord Marcus's daughter also approached him, offering anything he wanted in exchange for bringing back her parents. She even handed over a ring with mana in it, known as the Moglian Ring, a low-grade artifact that increased the wearer's mana. Ian noticed that it looked like the one from his previous life. With the ring on his finger, Ian gathered a group of knights and set out to find the missing lord. The Moglian Ring would compensate for his limited mana to some extent. The knights had taken our protagonist out to where they had tracked Marcus. They found a bunch of goblin corpses on the ground but no humans around. The knights suspected that a monster must have captured them. Ian scratched his chin, thinking they must have been ambushed by hundreds of goblins. He needed to find them before it was too late. He began to use his magic to summon a wolf, but a bright light blocked his spell. The knights watched in amazement as a cute little wolf with a fluffy body and a wagging tail appeared. In Ian's previous life, a huge wolf had appeared, but he guessed he wasn't strong enough to summon a full-sized one yet. He pointed to some blood on the floor and asked the wolf to pick up the scent and follow it. The wolf did as it was told, sniffing the floor and leading the way. The scene shifted to Lord Marcus, who was still alive and slaying goblins. These goblins were green, ugly creatures with long tongues, pointed noses, green skin, and red eyes. Marcus and his party were surrounded, with goblins coming from all angles. If this continued, they would all be annihilated. Marcus turned to his son and told him to escape to the castle while he distracted the monsters. As they were talking, a goblin approached from behind with a club in its hand. The son called out at the last second, but it was too late. The goblin was already high in the air and about to bring its weapon down on the lord's head. Suddenly, a flash of ice appeared, freezing all the enemies in place. The green scenery turned into an Arctic landscape, and everyone wondered what had just happened. The ice had come from Ian, who arrived at the last second to save the day. Any longer, and the Lord would have died, and the timeline would have been ruined. Marcus was so surprised by the situation and the sight of a child saving him that he began to pass out. When he woke up again, he found himself back in the castle with his daughter by his side. She explained that Ian had saved everyone, and the Lord and his son had been asleep for 2 days straight. An old man entered the room, seemingly a butler named Hogger, and was glad to see Marcus awake. He explained that 12 soldiers hadn't made it back, which upset Marcus. He asked where Ian was, as he wanted to meet him. Hogger left right away, rushing to the training grounds, where he found our protagonists. He told Ian that the Lord had awakened and wanted to meet him in the reception room. Ian looked a little confused but followed Hogger inside. There, he found Marcus and his son, Lobi, who thanked Ian from the bottom of their hearts for saving them. The Lord explained that Ian had not only protected Magrian's current and future leaders but also their territory by defeating the goblins. He wanted to repay Ian for this and gave him a box on a nearby table. Inside was the Moglian ring that Ian had borrowed earlier. Marcus had heard that Ian had felt mana in it and asked about its power. Ian explained that it was a ring that increased the wearer's mana, and it had helped him greatly in defeating the goblins. The Lord told Ian to keep the ring and think of it as a token of their promise. The Moglian family would serve him forever as an eternally honored guest, and Ian was always welcome to visit. They would stand by his side whenever he needed help. Marcus and Lobi pledged that this promise would last for future generations and go on for 1,000 years. Ian was grateful and asked if there was an alchemist in the territory skilled in making elixirs. Marcus informed him that there was an alchemist named Lidio in a place called Lyad Village. Lidio had originally been from the capital but had moved further north because of a rare medicinal herb. In his previous life, Ian had heard about a guy named Lidio. He knew he needed to find some elixirs to boost his low mana levels. Ian set out with a small group of knights to locate the Lyad village, as the Lord had told him. When they arrived, they were shocked to see the village in flames. One of the knights pointed towards it. They saw a bandit with an eye patch and a bloody hatchet over his shoulder. He ordered his men to grab the children and move quickly to the next place. They took a boy named Douglas who desperately resisted, kicking and screaming, pleading not to be taken from his family. Douglas's father tried to stop them, but the guy with the eye patch kicked him down and kept his foot on his back. Douglas struggled to break free, but it was futile. The eye patch bandit pulled out a knife, threatening to kill Douglas's father for resisting. As he prepared to strike, a sudden piece of ice appeared seemingly out of nowhere, hitting the bandit in the back and taking him down. Douglas watched the bloody scene. The remaining villains were baffled by this mysterious ice. More pieces of ice fell from the sky like a divine intervention, and the men fled in terror, not wanting to meet the same fate as their leader. The ice had come from our protagonist, who was perched on a nearby cliff, overlooking the scene. His new ring seemed to have boosted his mana significantly. He wondered if it allowed his mana capacity to rival that of a third-class magician. Ian descended to join the villagers who mourned those killed in the bandit attack. Fortunately, none of the knights were hurt. Ian was eager to find out if Lidio, the alchemist they had come for, had survived. He heard someone in the distance calling the alchemist's name. It was Douglas, and it turned out his father was Lidio, the very person Ian had sought. But Lidio was in bad shape. Ian pushed past Douglas to get a better look at him. Lidio had a pale complexion and strands of whitened hair, signs of mana poisoning. Mana poisoning was a terrible ailment, also known as God's curse. If someone with a mana brain, not a mana heart, received more mana than their body could handle, it would stimulate their brain and cause excruciating pain for the rest of their life. Ian knew Lidio couldn't have injected mana into himself. It must have been the work of a malevolent magician. Ian placed his hand on Lidio's forehead, providing some relief. Ian was ready to leave, knowing there was little more he could do. However, Douglas grabbed him, asking what he had done and if his father would be okay. Ian sadly explained that the curse couldn't be cured, and he had only offered temporary relief. Lidio would eventually return to suffering, facing a difficult choice: find a magician to alleviate his pain or succumb to it. Douglas looked heartbroken. He said he needed to find a special flower quickly to make medicine for his father. He mentioned that the flower could neutralize the mana in his father's body. He pushed past Ian and rushed to get it. At that moment, Ian remembered where he had heard the name Douglas before. In his past life, Douglas was one of the most outstanding alchemists in the entire empire. Despite a tough childhood, he became a genius and the emperor's closest aide. However, He had a deep hatred for magicians after his father was poisoned by one. He might even have been the alchemist who helped poison Ian in his past life. Realizing this, Ian turned around and caught up to Douglas. He grabbed him and told him not to go into the forest alone, as there might still be bandits around. Douglas objected, saying his father would die if he didn't get the flower. A tear ran down his cheek as he continued to plead. Seeing that Douglas wouldn't stop, Ian used his magic to put the kid to sleep. After a few seconds, Douglas was out cold and slumped onto Ian's shoulder. Ian took him to a discreet spot behind some bushes and laid him down. He contemplated what to do, thinking he should just kill Douglas to prevent the poison from being made in the future. However, he realized that acting too rashly could mess up the timeline. Douglas had the talent to become the best alchemist in the Empire, and Ian's thoughts were interrupted by a knight who had come to check on him. The knight noticed Douglas on the ground and was confused. Ian explained that he had put Douglas to sleep because he was about to do something reckless with bandits still around. Ian told the guard to carry him back to the village and then walked away into the forest. When the knight asked where he was going, Ian replied that there was something he needed to do alone. Back in the village at night, Lidio approached Douglas, who was awake and lying in his bed. Lidio had heard from a knight about Douglas's earlier reckless actions. Douglas explained that he had just wanted to find a flower that could help his father. Lidio scolded his son for his recklessness, given the presence of bandits in the area. Douglas got angry, asking what else he could do. They had been searching for this special flower for over a year, and Lydia would die without it. Douglas began to cry, wondering if the flower even existed. Suddenly, a cloaked man's voice called out to them from outside. They both turned to see who it was. The cloaked man revealed himself as the protagonist and apologized for disturbing them. He put an object on the table, which turned out to be the reindeer's flower encased in ice. Ian must have found it in the forest earlier. Ian offered to give them the flower if they answered a question first. He wanted to know how they had learned about the flower, whose effects were unknown to others. Lidio reluctantly revealed that he had read about it in a book passed down by his father. He produced the book and read from it. The reindeer's flower could neutralize mana and could only be found in the northern lands. It had 12 deep purple petals, and its leaves and stem were highly poisonous. If pulled directly from its roots, it would wither immediately, making gathering and cultivating it nearly impossible. Lidio explained that his family was involved in alchemy too, and it was a family business. Ian assumed that Lidio knew about the flower's other use as a deadly poison to magicians with both a mana heart and mana brain. Lidio insisted that his family would never make elixirs to harm people and swore on his family's honor. Ian glanced across the room at Douglas, who seemed nervous about the conversation. He thanked the alchemist for answering his question but also said sorry once the ice melted and the flower wilted. Ian admitted he couldn't properly harvest the flower. He'd only frozen it to keep its shape. Lidio felt disappointed and betrayed, asking why Ian tricked him. Ian explained he'd brought the flower to prove his skill in finding it. He suggested a deal. He'd use his magic to ease the alchemist's pain if the alchemist joined him in the capital. There, Ian wanted the alchemist to make special elixirs to boost his mana and help his future sick mother. Lidio wondered why Ian couldn't hire someone more skilled, given his own limited alchemical abilities. Ian insisted he needed someone loyal by his side and reminded the alchemist of Douglas's bravery earlier that day. Ian didn't want history to repeat itself when Lidio died because of an evil magician. Douglas got captured by bandits. Ian watched as Lidio and his son discussed the proposal privately. Ian thought about his past life and tragic events. He was determined not to let Lidio and Douglas suffer again and wanted to ensure they both had better lives this time. That concludes part 1 of this recap. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. What will happen next? If you would like to see a part 2 of this manhwa, let us know in the comments section below. Till next time.